Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube or on Rumble. Hello to Kirk. He says 5 more minutes till showtime, and it appears that I'm the first one in the chat. Hello, Kirk. Thank you so much for coming early to the show. And thank you, Mark, as well, who let the dogs out. Woof, woof, woof. I don't know if there are many dogs nowadays, because it seems that there is a serious desperation, and I don't know if the desperation is a dog trait. However, the panic is all over Europe and also now in Ukraine. We're going to discuss, of course, a secret Trump plan for Ukraine, which is mind-boggling. And I would like to tell you this is a 100% imperialist and colonialist project for Trump in Ukraine. I have to be consistent. I've been warning the Ukrainian people and officials about the risks of associating themselves completely and putting all their eggs in the basket of the United States and NATO. And this is now the time for, unfortunately, this is the politics, this is international relations, this is how the so-called rules-based international order is constructed. And therefore, the Ukrainians are probably going to pay the biggest price, and they have already paid the biggest price. I mean, from the sacrifices they have made, hundreds of thousands, the numbers are over 800,000 Ukrainians perished during this war. This is so tragic. And now the Americans are not only going to take their earth minerals, but also they're planning on taking their ports, they're planning on taking their fields, the agriculture, and at the same time they're planning on taking their airports and different infrastructure in Ukraine, which is mind-boggling. Now, before I continue in this discussion with you and the explanation of what is happening, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button as we start, because this channel is suppressed by YouTube. It's illogical what's happening on this channel. However, I'm very consistent, and I will continue doing these streams on YouTube and on Rumble until they kick me out of YouTube. But until then, I would really appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up and leave a comment, because that really helps. And just for you to know, tomorrow, on Wednesday, I'm going to host John Loveland. He is the director of the Forum of Democracy International, and he is a professor of political science and history, and he has been very critical of the globalists and critical of the EU approach in Ukraine and critical of NATO. So we're going to have definitely a very insightful discussion with him. So if you are interested in that, I would encourage you to subscribe to this YouTube channel and hit the notification bell, whatever is that. So I check the statistics all the time, and it seems 50% of the followers or the people who watch the streams on Syriana Analysis are not subscribed. So imagine if at least 50% of the people who are watching today this channel would subscribe. Those who are not subscribed, that would be really great help for me as well. So as you may know, the foreign ministers of the United States and Russia have met in Riyadh. This has been the first session of talks. And we're going to start this conversation with you just by showing you some videos about this meeting that has been taken in or took place in Riyadh. And as you can see, the Saudi officials were present during the recipient of the foreign minister of Russia here, Sergei Lavrov, and then in the meeting room, the American officials were also present there. This is unprecedented. Since 2022, there has been no official meeting on a diplomatic level or even on a security level between the both sides, and reports indicate that both sides even stopped their emergency communication, which is really horrible, to be honest with you, that the US and the Russians, big nuclear powers, stopped communicating on the risks of the Ukraine war and where it could lead also in this case. So this is for the first time such a meeting of high level has happened in Riyadh. And I think this is also a message to the so-called rules-based international order, or to the unipolar world, that the unipolarity is changing. And just by let's say just by holding or this meeting in Saudi Arabia sends a lots of signals that the diplomatic might or the peacemakers are no longer in Europe, for example. It's not in Switzerland, it's not in Geneva, it's not in Germany, it's not in Ukraine, it's not in any European country, not even in Hungary or in any country which tried to be more neutral regarding the Ukraine conflict, but rather in Saudi Arabia. I think this is also an indication from the Russians and from the Americans that there are other poles rising or other regional powers are gaining momentum, and also they could play the mediator role in a world where we have, unfortunately, many hot-headed politicians, many ideologues, radical ideologues, who up until this moment, and I'm going to show you some examples, cannot fathom the fact that the world has changed after the Ukraine war and that their approach has proven to be wrong, so that they could take a little bit shift in the course, but they refuse to do that and they continue in the same approach and expecting different results. And I'm going to show you a few examples about that. So what happened today has been very significant. And we have news coming from Saudi Arabia for some of the, let's say, headlines that have been discussed. For example, the Russia-US talks in Riyadh have wrapped up. Those are the key takeaways. Negotiations went well, says the Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov. No set date yet for Putin-Trump meeting. Both sides agree that Russia and the United States cannot afford not to communicate. Separate teams will begin contacts on Ukraine in due course. The meeting was a very serious conversation on all issues. The dialogue has started, but the road ahead remains unclear. At least the ball is rolling. Yes, at least diplomacy has been activated in this case. This is a good start between the both sides. And we have also more developments coming from Riyadh. For example, our friend Brian McDonald says that things are really moving very fast in Saudi Arabia. Those are the key developments in the past 45 minutes. For example, Lavrov and Rubio agreed to create negotiation groups on Ukraine and a mechanism to ease tensions in US-Russia relations. This is according to Reuters. Then three-stage peace plan on the table. First, ceasefire in Ukraine, then elections in Ukraine, and finally, we have a final agreement. This is according to Fox News. So in this case, even if, let's say, Zelensky says that he doesn't accept any deal that could come from the bilateral meeting between the US and Russia, if these two superpowers agree, then there could probably be elections in Ukraine, because remember that Zelensky canceled the elections because he said that there is an emergency situation in the country and he enacted the emergency powers, and accordingly he canceled the elections because he said some parts of Ukraine are out of the reach of the government and these people cannot vote. However, there are two things that I would like to mention here. First, that the regions that Ukraine lost were overwhelmingly populated by pro-Russian people, whether they're ethnic or Russian-speaking people and other minorities. So definitely these people were not going to vote overwhelmingly for him or any other government that despises them. And secondly, if the Americans impose on the Ukrainians, Zelensky will not stay in power. And I think that the elections will definitely result in a different candidate from the let's say, the transatlantic side, or a side that supports the EU and NATO, and there will be also a candidate from more, let's say, neutral or pro-Russian side, because I think Russia will not accept that elections would be only held by people or among people who are all pro-European or pro-NATO, because remember that Zelensky has banned several political parties. He detained some of the politicians. He said those are collaborators with Russia, and also closed the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, saying that this church also is affiliated to Russia. So there is definitely a type of a persecution against politically motivated and religious motivated persecution, let's say, against the opponents of Zelensky. Probably this will be reversed under certain agreement between the United States and Russia. So if we go back to what have been discussed in this case, we see that economic ties back on the agenda again. Russia and the US agreed to cooperate on investment and energy prices post-settlement. The embassy staffing to be restored in Moscow and Washington, and a major thawing move This is according to, the American diplomats will return to Moscow and Russian diplomats will return to Washington. The State Department says that one meeting won't solve Ukraine, but Riyadh was an important step forward. Zelensky fumes and says talks without Kyiv are just bilateral Russia-US agreements, not peace talks. Finally, Trump and Putin both believe Zelensky's re-election chances are slim, according to Fox News. The ground is shifting fast. I don't, to be honest with you, need Fox News or anyone to tell me this. I truly believe that there is an increasing resentment against Zelensky, not because of his first decision to face the Russian offensive, because he was popular when the first World War started in the areas that he already controlled, but by the passing of time and by the miseries that have been inflicted and the pain that have been inflicted upon the Ukrainian people, with hundreds of thousands of casualties, and there is no strategy in the horizon. And the people are tired. They don't want to fight any longer. Let's say the economy has been destroyed. I think those conditions, economic conditions and the livelihood conditions, and also the killing that happened against the Ukrainian people, have all these factors participated in diminishing the popularity of Zelensky. So if any elections would be held, I don't think that Zelensky would be one of the candidates. Now, at the same time that we have this meeting between Rubio and Lavrov and other Russian and American officials, European countries, some of the European countries, I think there are 7 or 8 countries, they say they represent the European Union, but they excluded 20 other European countries. So they met and they have made a statement in the name of Emmanuel Macron. And Emmanuel Macron says, after bringing together several European leaders, I just have spoken with Donald Trump and Zelensky. He says, we seek a strong and lasting peace in Ukraine. To achieve this, Russia must end its aggression, and this must be accompanied by strong and credible security guarantees for the Ukrainians, also for the Russians, right? He doesn't mention that. Otherwise, there is a risk that this ceasefire will end up like the Minsk agreement. And this is a little bit ironic that he brings the issue of the Minsk agreement, because let's remember that the Minsk agreement has been signed by Russia and Ukraine, and also the mediators, I believe, were France, the US, and Germany. And after the Minsk agreement, the Russian forces continued shelling eastern parts of Ukraine in the Donbas region, and eventually led to the killing of thousands of civilians from the Ukrainians, right? Also, we have to remember that 2 former European senior officials like Angela Merkel and François Hollande, both of them, who were basically the guarantors of this agreement, the Minsk Agreement 1 and 2, they have both explicitly and clearly and honestly said that this agreement was not meant to be implemented. In the contrast, it was meant for Ukraine to buy time. Both Angela Merkel and Holland said that this agreement was meant to buy time for Ukraine in order to send reinforcement and rearm Ukraine, and for Ukraine to be ready for war against Russia. So this is how some of the Western governments use the agreement to freeze the conflict in order to arm Ukraine to the teeth and prepare for the war with Russia. So I think that there has to be some honesty about these cases, especially from France. If France wants for Europe to play an independent role like he is aspiring, and he doesn't want for the Americans to dictate what they have to do in Europe, I think they have to change their approach. And in order to be part of the game, right, they have to present proposals. They have to be honest, and they have to say that this has been the mistake of the United States. We didn't want for Ukraine to join NATO, and all this expansion of NATO to the east was an American project. Whether they were Democrats or Republicans, it doesn't matter. But this was the mistake of the US. Don't hold us accountable for it, and we want to change course. We were against the expansion of NATO, which is true. They were against the expansion of NATO to to Ukraine, until the war started in 2022, and everybody started talking about the candidacy. But before that, the French, the Germans were telling the Americans, what are you doing? Why are you pushing this on the borders, to the borders with Russia? This will lead into war. They knew it. They knew it. They said it behind closed doors, but in public they're not able to be honest, or only once. They have to be honest with Russia, and they have to be honest with the Ukrainians, and they have to strike a deal with Russia accordingly, right? But they're refusing to do that. They're repeating the same cassette, let's say, all over again in this case. So Macron says we will work on this together with the Europeans, Americans, and Ukraine. This is the key. We are convinced that Europeans must invest better, more, and together in their security and defense, both for today and for the future. To this end, Europeans want to accelerate the implementation of their own agenda for sovereignty, security, and competitiveness. Work will continue based on the European Commission's proposals, both in supporting Ukraine and in developing and investing in our defense. This agenda, defined in 2022 at the Versailles Summit, must simply be carried out. Decisions, actions, coherence quickly. I will continue these discussions in the coming days. Look, the problem with the European leaders, they want to increase the defense expenditure, right? They want to create their European NATO. They want to create their own security force, something that can play a deterrent role against their enemies. And in this case, of course, once you want to create such an army, who are you sending the message to? It's for the Russians. You see the Russians as an enemy. So you're not interested in striking a security architecture, a new security deal with Russia. If you're going to arm yourself against Russia, means that you still see Russia as an enemy. So this is the difference now between the American approach and the European approach, that the Americans say Russia doesn't pose a threat against NATO, and the Europeans say no, Russia poses a threat. So if the Europeans want to pursue this path, this means that they have to increase their expenditure. But in order to increase the expenditure, they have to be competitive on the economic level. And this means they need cheap energy resources. This is something that is missing in the discussion because they have isolated themselves from the Russian markets and they don't want to buy. But if they want to restore ties with Russia and buy gas from Russia in order to build their armies again, I think Russia will not give them this gas. So it's a really difficult situation. Where are they going to bring the money, right? This is not something like $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion. They're talking about a project that could have tens of billions of dollars worth of budget. So are they going to tax the people? Are they going to increase to create an inflation, which is taxation in one way or another, undeclared? What are they going to do about it? Are they going to create what is called the defense pact bond? Sorry. So there are different things that they're trying to do. Definitely printing money is not a solution. And in the current economic situation with Germany, France, and the rest of Europe, there is no competitive economies in Germany vis-a-vis China, Russia, and the United States for them to create such an army and be independent from the United States and be a deterrent power against Russia. There is no money for that. So how are they going to do that? Let's see in the coming days or weeks. And tomorrow, probably I will also ask our respected guest, who will come to Syriana Analysis tomorrow, and it's going to be a very interesting discussion with John Loveland. He's director of the Forum of Democracy, and he's a professor of political science and history. So if you're looking forward for that, subscribe and stay tuned for tomorrow's discussion at the same time, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. So as I mentioned, there is like a cassette being repeated among some of the European officials, let's say. They have created an echo chamber for themselves, and they're repeating the same things that other officials are repeating. So they're completely detached from the reality. And at the same time, they're repeating the same approach and expecting different results. One of the people who posted today was Guy Verhofstadt. Guy Verhofstadt says, if European countries want a seat at the table, we have to earn it by imposing costs on Russia. Sanction Putin's shadow fleet, seize Russian money in Europe's banks and send it to Ukraine, commit 3% GDP in defense. If the EU is broken, use a coalition of the willing. To be honest with you, this is really ridiculous. Like, how many times they have to impose sanctions on Russia and how many times they have to impose them and expect different results. This is the definition of insanity, to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. There is no way to see it. I mean, now the Europeans, when they see that the US is abandoning them, this is an opportunity for them to open channels with China and ask China to mediate with Russia, which is a reliable partner of Russia, and activate diplomacy with them and offer a better deal for Russia in order for Russia to join, because Europe and Russia are in the Eurasian region, and they have to coexist somehow, right? And Russia is interested in good relationship with Europe, Central Europe and Western Europe. It is in their interest to have good relationship with them. So this would be an opportunity for them to tell Russia through, for example, China, that we offer a better deal and we are neighbors, and this was a mistake. The expansion of NATO, this was the mistake of the United States. We didn't want it, and we will withdraw from this case, and we agree on a neutral Ukraine, and this is a buffer zone for us, between us. I think that the Russians would accept a deal with Europe, but if they continue on the same approach, where is this going to end if the Americans agree with the Russians? Europe will completely isolate itself from the United States and from Russia, because they have already isolated themselves from Russia. And this is like suicidal. I don't see why, like, I'm being critical for the approach, like, those are not my countries, but I'm an analyst, and I just don't understand it, like, it's not logical for me, at least. Maybe for them, but for me not. Just excuse me. I just want to thank our friend, Mr. Rifley. This is one of those weeks where decades happen, I guess. Exactly. Sometimes several years pass and nothing happens, or there is like a conflict has been frozen, and then in a few days everything changes, like what happened in Syria. Everything changed in a matter of 14 days after 14 years of war, and now in the Ukraine conflict, it's similar. So now we have Trump is basically offering a ridiculous offer to Ukraine, which is, I would say, this is pure imperialism and pure colonialism of Ukraine, right? So this is an article by The Telegraph, and they have broken this news. They say, revealed Trump's confidential plan to put Ukraine in a stranglehold. So what Americans are offering for Ukraine? Trump's demand for $500 billion payback from Ukraine goes far beyond US control over the country's critical minerals. So what do they want besides the critical minerals? It covers everything from ports and infrastructure to oil and gas and the larger resource base of the country. The term of the contract that landed at Zelensky's office a week ago amount to the US economic colonization of Ukraine in legal perpetuity. I think this is the first time we could see the term imperialism and colonialism on the Telegraph. For the first time, they probably realized that the US is an imperialist power, but they're coming in defense of Ukraine. But when the United States does similar thing to Syria, for example, they will say nothing. In the contrary, they will support the Americans' looting of Syria's resources, the sanctions, and all the evil acts that US politicians have done in Syria in order to strangle and slowly kill the Syrian people. They will not say anything about it, or they will not compare it to colonialism or imperialism, but now in Ukraine they do. They rightfully so. This is an economic colonization. But the hypocrisy of this British media outlet is just staggering, right? So we have the US is basically trying to economically colonize Ukraine, and it implies a burden of reparations that cannot possibly be achieved. The document has caused consternation and panic in Kyiv. The Telegraph has obtained a draft of the pre-decisional contract marked privileged and confidential and dated February 7, 2025. It seems that Zelensky has leaked this document to the press or to the British intelligence, and the British intelligence has given him to the Telegraph. So the document states that the United States and Ukraine should form a joint investment fund to ensure that hostile parties to the conflict do not benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine, basically Russia. So the agreement covers the economic value associated with resources of Ukraine, including mineral resources, oil and gas resources, ports, other infrastructure as agreed, leaving it unclear what else might be encompassed. The United States will take 50% of recurring revenues received by Ukraine from extraction of resources and 50% of financial value of all new licenses issued to third parties for the future monetization of resources. That clause means pay us first and then feed your children later, said one source close to the negotiations. So all the new agreements and investment deals that Ukraine may strike in the future with third country companies, the United States wants 50% of the revenues of these companies. It's crazy. It states that for all future licenses, the US will have a right of first refusal for the purchase of exportable minerals. So if a third country comes and wants to buy some rare earth minerals, the United States has the right to veto selling these earth minerals to third country companies, which means if Russia wants to come or China probably wants to come and buy some of the minerals from Ukraine, the United States can veto and block this deal. This is like they own the country and what is under the country, right? And Washington will have sovereign immunity and acquire near total control over most of Ukraine's commodity and resource economy. Zelensky himself proposed the idea of giving the US a direct stake in Ukraine's rare earth elements and critical minerals on a visit to Trump Tower in September, hoping to smooth the way for continued arms. It seems that Zelensky himself, probably installed this idea in the mind of Trump that we give you some of the earth minerals in exchange for military support, and now Trump wants to take everything from Zelensky. He calculated that it would lead to US companies setting operations on the ground, creating a political tripwire that would deter Putin from attacking again. He probably didn't expect to be confronted with terms normally imposed on aggressor states defeated in a war. Yes, look, in this case, definitely Ukraine was not technically the aggressor, but it is the defeated one in the war, right? They are worse than the financial penalties imposed on Germany and Japan after their defeat in 1945. If this draft were accepted, Trump's demands would amount to a higher share of Ukrainian GDP than reparations imposed on Germany at the Versailles Treaty. Trump told Fox News that Ukraine had essentially agreed to hand over $500 billion. He warned that Ukraine would be handed to Putin on a plate if it rejected the terms. Trump said the US had spent $300 billion on the war so far, adding that it would be stupid to hand over any more. But according to the Telegraph, they say that the number or the amount of the US support is around 120 billion. I don't know why Trump says 300 billion or what are the calculations. Just I'm saying that the Telegraph says that this is not true. So the Republican Senator, Lindsey Graham, who is very happy with this war, and he says this is the best American investment, that Russians are dying and no American soldiers basically are perishing in this conflict, and who is eyeing on the earth minerals of Ukraine, who is no friend of Ukraine, by the way, but he has been received many times by Zelensky, and Zelensky almost kissed his hands. It's ridiculous. This guy is a complete sociopathic maniac, and he has been received and red carpets were rolled for him, and he's just eyeing on the destruction of Ukraine and looting its minerals, right, its resources. And he's now trying to convince the Ukrainians to accept Trump's deal. He suggested at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend that Trump's demand was a clever ploy to bolster declining popular support for the Ukrainian cause. He says he can go to the American people and say Ukraine is not a burden, it is a benefit. Graham also told the Europeans to root hard for the idea because it locks Washington into defending a future settlement. If we sign this minerals agreement, Putin is screwed because Trump will defend the deal. But do you know who is also screwed? Look, Putin is definitely not screwed, and I will tell you why. Because some of these very important earth minerals are located in the areas that Russia already occupied, and permanently they're not going to give it back. So Russia definitely benefited from the earth minerals of Ukraine, and he's not screwed. You know who is screwed? Who is not screwed is Russia and United States. Who is really screwed is Ukraine. Something that the American officials would not tell. They're screwed if let's say 20% to 20%, 20 to 25% of the earth's minerals go to Russia because they annex these regions. This means 75% of the earth's minerals will go to the United States, and they will have nothing, or 50% of this, right? They will basically be completely naked in front of everyone. It's really sad how this situation has developed in Ukraine, seriously. So we have Ukraine cannot possibly meet his $500 billion demand in any meaningful time frame, leaving aside the larger matter of whether it is honorable to treat a victim nation in this fashion after it has held the battle line for the liberal democracies at enormous sacrifice for 3 years. Like, there are a few things here. One is morals do not play any role in the settlement of wars, right? It's who won the war or who suffered the most, and they see the balance of power, and it's clearly on the side of Russia in this case, or even the Americans are trying to strike a deal with the Russians. So compared to the United States, Ukraine is very, very small and very weak player, right, on the chessboard. So in this case, morals do not play a role, but rather the victors or which party has gained more points in the war and in diplomacy. And at the same time, Ukraine is not a liberal democracy, and it's not defending liberal democracy. Let's be clear about it. Ukraine is not a liberal democracy. Ukraine is a very corrupt place with a very corrupt political system. And at the same time, there is an organized persecution against the opposition, political opposition, and also against religious minorities. Therefore, I don't think that this is the definition of liberal democracy. So let's not sell lies to the people, right? Yes, Ukraine is probably defending the transatlantic union or the transatlantic coalition, and they're being used as a pawn, as a cannon fodder to fight against Russia. This is a geopolitical conflict. This is about money and finances. So you see everything, right? Geopolitics, and we have money. And the major proof for it is what Trump is trying to do, to take away the earth minerals, and the Russians are going to take the earth minerals in the east as well. So let's not talk about what this liberal democracy. I think this is really ridiculous that they keep repeating in the press. So just a final 2 notes in this article. In genuine commerce, the other side can usually walk away. Trump's demand is iron fist coercion by a new imperial power against a weaker nation with its back to the wall and all of the commodity bonanza that exists chiefly in Trump's head. Zelensky doesn't have the luxury. Thank you for at least being honest here. He has to pick between the military violation of Ukraine by Putin and the economic violation of Ukraine by his own ally. This is the only, I think, true and truthful conclusion that we could come after reading this article, and that is Zelensky is between 2 hard rocks. He is either going to be torn apart by the Russian military machine, or he's going to be economically raped by Trump's administration. Very, very sad, but very expected, and very like this is the anticipated outcome, unfortunately, of this war. But we still have European and this time British diplomats completely detached from the reality again. And they're speaking about there can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine. Putin's preconditions for talks that Ukraine abandon swaths of its sovereign territory and its right to choose its alliances are unacceptable. Any peace must protect Ukraine's security and independence. Take a look.
Putin's so-called preconditions for talks, reaffirmed by his deputy foreign minister just a few days ago, have been that Ukraine withdraw from its own sovereign territory and abandon its sovereign right to choose its alliances. No country could or should accept this. So we can and must create the conditions for a just and lasting peace, which protects Ukraine's security, sovereignty, and independence. This will require robust security arrangements from the outset, which ensure that Russia is never able to invade again. Putin has shown time and again that he will break a weak deal. The UK will continue to play our part. We will continue to provide concrete support for Ukraine's self-defense and security for as long as it is needed. And we are clear that Ukraine's voice must be at the heart of any negotiations.
This is complete delusional, And what is really upsetting is that the UK played a major role in this escalation. And the UK deep state is responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. Let's remember that in the spring of 2022, the peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, not between Russia and the West, was ready. Like in spring 2022 and in the Istanbul talks, the draft resolution was clear. Like this was a deal between Russia and Ukraine. And Russia accepted to strike, let's say, a deal with Ukraine as an independent state. Now, after 3 years of this war, Russia doesn't see Ukraine as an independent player, and they don't want to strike a deal with Ukraine. They basically want to strike a deal with the boss, and the boss is the United States. The UK is a very small player in this. Yes, they have given support, they have participated in the intelligence black ops, they have done really crazy things in Ukraine, just like they did in Syria. But at the end of the day, when you put the math and the numbers in front of you, the US is the boss. And the US will impose this deal on the rest of the Western countries. And the UK will not be able to play another sabotaging role, because when they played this sabotaging role, the Biden administration was in the administration. And the Biden administration wanted to prolong this war because they saw it as an opportunity to weaken Russia. But it has backfired. Okay, 3 years, hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Trump wants to wrap up this conflict, which means the rest of the Western countries will follow suit. This is the bitter truth for the Europeans to understand. And now, another bitter truth for the Europeans to understand is that Russia will not strike a deal with Ukraine. It will strike a deal with the boss of Ukraine, and that is the United States. And this was clear by a statement by the ambassador of Russia to the UN. As I showed you the statement of the ambassador of the UK to the UN, and now this is the Russia at the UN. He says Russia has now irrevocably lost not only Crimea, but also the DPR, LPR, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, which have become part of Russia. The future Ukraine must be demilitarized, neutral state, not part of any blocs or alliances. Take a look.
Все это остается актуальным, с той лишь разницей, что Украина теперь безвозвратно потеряла не только Крым, но и Донецкую и Луганскую народные республики, и Херсонскую и Запорожскую области, вошедшие в состав России. Ну и последнее. Будущее Украины должна быть демилитаризованным нейтральным государством, не входящим ни в какие блоки и альянсы. Все это остается актуальным.
So, in this case, we have to mention that the demands of Russia has also increased, and they feel emboldened because on the ground they see the realities and the facts and how the Ukrainian forces cannot stand against the Russian offensive. And the future is that they can strike a deal with the United States and sideline Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't exist on the map in their eyes. I'm talking from their perspective, right? So the regions that they have occupied, it's now permanently annexed by Russia, something that was let's say in spring 2022, Ukraine could have kept these territories for itself by peace agreement. But the time for such a deal, that Russia would withdraw from the regions they have occupied and go back for direct negotiations with Ukraine, are over from the Russian perspective. So this is the new situation. This is the new reality for the European leaders to adapt. But I've seen many commentaries recently by people, whether they're Ukrainians or they support Ukraine as long as it takes, Ukraine will emerge victorious and Russia will be defeated, this and that. But now they see that the situation has changed immensely, dramatically, and it's not in favor of Ukraine. And now they're saying, oh my God, like Ukraine should not have given up its nuclear weapons, right? This is something that I've seen a lot recently. For example, one of these accounts posts this video. He says, if Ukraine still had nukes, Russia would never have invaded. Take a look.
In 1994, Ukraine signed a deal to give up its nukes, like the one behind me. This is an intercontinental ballistic missile, in exchange for its security and its sovereignty. And the West promised Ukraine that. And in 2014, when Putin took Crimea, Angela Merkel and the rest of the West took Putin for a champagne brunch and congratulated him. They opened the Nord Stream pipeline and they paved the way for Putin, believing he could do whatever he wants in Ukraine. And that is why this invasion happened in 2022, because of the West's betrayal. And now, last week, Trump sends his MAGA delegation right to the capital here in Kyiv to congratulate Putin on invading Ukraine, on the genocide and the pillage of this country. And I've come here to show the scale of the stockpiles that this country had, the third largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. And it's absolutely galling to see, and galling to see all of these weapons gather dust. And America has completely lost its integrity with this. No country is ever going to give up its nukes ever again and listen to the West's guarantees. And it's vital to remember too, if the West hadn't convinced Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, this country would not have been invaded by Russia. Russia would never have done it. When Ukraine wins this war, it won't be because of the West, it will be in spite of the West.
So there are a few things missing in this conversation, this video, basically. One of which is Ukraine never possessed a nuclear weapon independently. During the Soviet era, the nuclear weapons stationed on Ukrainian territories were owned and controlled by the Soviet Union. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine inherited a significant number of nuclear weapons, but they relinquished them. And they have done it voluntarily. In 1994, Ukraine joined the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state and transferred all nuclear warheads to Russia for dismantling. And this process has been completed in 1996. Basically, those nuclear weapons belonged to the Soviet Union, not for Ukraine. And Russia is the successor of the Soviet Union. Those weapons were made by the Soviet Union, not by Ukraine, right? So this element that is missing in the discussion is very important. This is a really important piece of information, number one. Secondly, when Russia and Ukraine and the West, they have struck the deal, so to transfer the weapons, these nuclear weapons, to Russia and to destroy them in exchange for security guarantees, the candidacy of Ukraine for NATO was not on the table. So this has changed in 2008 when George Bush has supported the candidacy of Ukraine to join NATO, also similar to Georgia, right? So the conditions have changed also from both sides. In any ways, Ukraine didn't have them. And thankfully, they didn't have them. Because in the current mindset governing Kyiv, it would have been a disastrous if Ukraine had nuclear weapons. So since we're speaking about nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, I just want to mention an information that I have been reading today. I was reading a document. I just want to show you just the first page of the document for you to know what I'm talking about. This is a document published by the OPCW this week, and basically they have struck a deal with Syria, with Jolani's Syria. So this agreement basically is giving the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was involved in doctoring and manipulating the report of Duma in 2018. And they have changed the conclusions against the will of the inspectors who were on the ground in Syria and did the research and the investigation. They have sidelined all these researchers, and now they have everyone in the team loyal to the administration of the OPCW, which is loyal to the United States. So they have struck the deal with Syria under Jolani that they will send a team of inspectors to Syria in order to oversee what chemical weapons stockpile Syria still has. The problem is Assad was overthrown in 2 months ago and 10 days. So 70 days ago, Assad was overthrown. And for 70 days, they haven't found yet any chemical weapons in Syria because they didn't exist. But now with the inspectors going to Syria, I would speculate and say that soon you will hear reports from Syria basically claiming that they found the stockpile of these chemical weapons in Syria. I would not rule out that at all. OPCW has played a very dirty role in Syria, and I will not rule out that they would continue playing this dirty role in Syria again. And some of the clauses or the articles of this agreement also mentions that the OPCW may have permanent inspectors in Syria. This is one way or another they're trying to disarm Syria, and this will later extend, of course, not only to the so-called or the alleged chemical weapons, they will come after the ballistic missile programs. I mean, Israel already destroyed most of Syria's weapons, but they will try to completely, let's say, castrate Syria with the help of the OPCW. This is something that I wanted to mention since we're speaking about chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Kirk, thank you so much for your generous support. I really appreciate it. So we have now, since we moved from Ukraine to Syria, Donald Trump basically, he agreed that Israel would stay in Syria for years and without it's an open end, right? So Trump says that he will support Israel in maintaining a buffer zone in Syria for years to come. Although the EU and the UN are making significant progress in normalizing relations with the new Syrian regime of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, including at a major summit in Paris on Thursday, the Israel is confident that the Trump administration understands Jerusalem's concerns that the new regime could be a wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay. In that sense, even if the Europeans at the UN start pressuring Israel to withdraw in the coming months, as long as Israel has support from the US to maintain the buffer zone, the Israeli occupation forces are expected to remain there for a very extended period, which means forever. They're permanently occupied this. So with Abu Muhammad al-Jolani not even committing to elections before a period of 4 years passes, Israel believes it will be able to viably argue that the true colors of the regime will not be clear even by the end of 2025. This is, of course, ridiculous. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani has already struck the deal with Israel to give up Quneitira, to give up the high hills, to give up on the Golan Heights in exchange for him to stay in power. This has been done through the Turkish intelligence and through the joint intelligence operation rooms of Israel and Turkey in Syria. And Jolani has received instructions from his boss in Ankara and in Qatar to not upset Israel at all, and he has been a very good boy about this case. So let's be clear about that. But we have our friend who has been very critical of Jolani's regime, David Miller, Professor David Miller. He posted a video about this exact particular case. I want to show you this short video for us to get more perspective if Jolani poses any threat, basically, to the Israeli occupation forces. Take a look.
The idea that Turkey or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or the Syrian National Army or any of the factions who have collapsed the Assad government will take on the Israelis is a fiction, is a fantasy, and is a joke. They've already been saying, Jolani has been saying that they will not take on Israel. At the same time, they've allowed Israel to remove all the capability of Syria as a nation to defend itself. And of course, they've even been, the rebels, the so-called rebels, have even been taking Syrian Arab army guns and giving them to the IDF for destruction. I mean, you couldn't have more of an indication that these are collaborators with the Zionists and not enemies of the Zionists. They will never be enemies of the Zionists.
Those are true words from Professor David Miller. And it's a fantasy. It's an absurd fantasy. It's a illusion to think that the Jolani's regime will attack Israel or try to even liberate the territories occupied by the Israeli side. And the Jolani regime has been installed thanks to an agreement between Turkey and Israel. So he's part of the system now. Syria is now reorienting itself towards the rules-based international order, and he's becoming part of the World Economic Forum. He's going to be part of the European Association Agreement, and he's going to allow a NATO country, Turkey, to establish military bases in central Syria, and Israel has established 7 military posts in southern Syria. And what has Jolani done about it? Nothing, zero, right? So let's be clear about that. And I want to show you a photo, which is very, in my opinion, it shows everything you need to know about the new Syrian regime. And this is the foreign minister of Jolani, Ahmad Shibani, and this is Joe Wilson. Joe Wilson is an Israel First U.S. representative, and he is part of the Israel-U.S. Alliance Forum, and he's a proponent and a supporter of a genocide against the Palestinians. He's an active lobbyist for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, and this is Ahmad Shibani is giving thumbs up with him. See? And I captioned this. I says, "We did it, Joe." You remember this meme of Kamala Harris, and they said, "We did it, Joe." This is the same. We did it, Joe. We did it. We gave the Golan Heights to Israel, as our friend Syrian Girl Partisan says. Mohsen says, this guy, Joe Wilson, sucks Zionist teeth like no other, even if he has to sell his mom in an ISIS slave market to please his Zionist handlers, he will do it. I mean, what can I say? By the way, around 500 people watching this on YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. Half of you has pressed the thumbs up. I would really appreciate it if the rest do the same in order to navigate through the algorithm of YouTube and help me with the suppression, because this channel is suppressed. And since we're speaking about Israel and Syria, I will show you a news on Al Jazeera Arabic. And you know my position on Al Jazeera Arabic. I have been telling you it's a PSYOP. They serve the American interests, they serve Israeli interests, and they play a double game in the region. They are very sophisticated PSYOP, psychological operation against the Arabic people. And they basically, I use the term donkeyfied. They donkeyfy the Arabic masses. What I mean by that is they try to create a generation that is not really critical about these political cases, and they even deliberately either distort the news or publish complete fake news, and without even getting community notes. And the vast majority of the Arab people who watch it, they will believe it because they will not double check the information. They will just read the title and they will think that Al Jazeera is credible and what they have reported about Syria and Israel is correct. And I will show you this example. So this is a news on Al Jazeera Arabic, right? So if you click the translation, it says, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad was not in Israel's interest, right? This is what Al Jazeera said. So I will show you the video of Benjamin Netanyahu talking about Syria, because Al Jazeera is quoting Benjamin Netanyahu from his press conference with Marco Rubio. So this is the segment of Benjamin Netanyahu and Marco Rubio, right? Both of them, when they spoke about Syria. Please let me know in which paragraph or in which segment or in which sentence any of them mentioned this information. Take a look.
We also discussed the situation in Syria after the collapse of Assad's regime, a collapse that was made possible by Israel's weakening of Iran's terror axis, especially the weakening of Hezbollah and the removal of Nasrallah. For over a decade before October 7th, Israel acted to prevent Iran from developing new terror fronts against us in Syria, right opposite the Golan Heights and deeper in Syria. And we conducted hundreds of airstrikes, perhaps 1,000, in order to prevent it, and we did. Now, if any other force in Syria today believes that Israel will permit other hostile forces to use Syria as a base of operations against us, they are gravely mistaken. Israel will act to prevent any threat from emerging near our border in southwest Syria.
On the broader issues that we discussed as well is the questions in Syria. And while the fall of Assad is certainly promising and important, if Syria replacing one destabilizing force for another is not a positive development. And that is something that we will watch very carefully as we seek to craft our own strategy with regards to how to approach the events in Syria.
So this was around the 20 minutes of press conference, maybe even less. And I checked the entire press conference. I transcribed it. I searched for the term Syria, Assad, and everything. And this was the only time they spoke about Syria. 2 minutes. 1 minute Netanyahu and 1 minute Marco Rubio. Was there any statement indicating that Netanyahu says, basically, quote, that the fall of the Assad regime was not in favor of Israel? No, nothing. But Al Jazeera deliberately published this. because they want to support the Jolani government at the time when Jolani is a complicit with Israel and not doing anything about the Israeli occupation forces of more Syrian lands. So this is what I published about the case. I say, here is how Al Jazeera shamelessly manipulates and donkeyifies the Arabic masses. This Qatari-owned propaganda machine, funded by the same regime that bankrolls the Al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria, aka HTS, has twisted Benjamin Netanyahu's words to fit their toxic narrative. They claim Netanyahu said ousting Bashar al-Assad was not Israel's favor. But let's set the record straight, because Al Jazeera won't. Netanyahu's actual and full statement was, Syria's collapse was made possible by Israel's weakening of the axis, he says, the evil of resistance. Since before October 7, Israel had been acting to prevent new terror fronts against them right opposite the Golan Heights and deeper inside Syria, perhaps 1,000 airstrikes to prevent it. This is yet another glaring example of Al Jazeera's deceitful tactics, deliberately distorting facts to serve their agenda and mislead their audience. It's not journalism, it's propaganda, plain and simple. Our friend Hadi says Al Jazeera didn't even twist it here, as they usually do. They fabricated a whole statement opposite to what was really said, which is so true, because I said Al Jazeera twisted. They didn't twist it. They completely made up a new statement from Netanyahu. And one of our friends says Israel, along with Turkey and the West, had been backing Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist groups in Syria since 2011 to overthrow Assad. They all played a role in destabilizing Syria and ultimately orchestrating his removal last December. This was never about democracy or stability. It was about regime change at any cost. It's very true about that. I want to thank Emilio Alexander for his generous support. Thank you so much, guys, for this generous support, really. So tomorrow is going to be a discussion on Syriana Analysis, very, very interesting one. I'm going to show you the account of our friend John Laughlin on X, so you could also follow him beforehand, before we start this conversation tomorrow with him. He is the director of the Forum of Democracy International. He says he is fighting globalism worldwide. He is a professor in political science and history at Institut Catholique Vendée. So tomorrow it's going to be 1 hour discussion with him about the possible peace agreement between the United States and Russia, and the exclusion of the European countries. And is peace possible without the participation of the European countries? He is very critical of the EU, very critical of NATO, but I'm very interested to hear. I'm trying to have like a chit for a chat with him. So if you are excited and looking forward to it, please subscribe to Syriana Analysis. 50% of the views on Syriana Analysis are from people who aren't subscribed, and probably they don't know that they're not subscribed. So that would be really amazing and very helpful for me. And if you want to support the content of this video so that it could reach to more people, you can hit the thumbs up and leave a comment. Those are really important for me. And if you want to do more for Syriana Analysis to support independent journalism, you can become a patron, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis, or there are other means in the description below. Some of you don't want to use Patreon, so I made accounts on different platforms that you prefer. That would be only if you can, okay? So this is all for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're watching this on YouTube or on Rumble, and I will see you tomorrow on Wednesday, 5 p.m. Central European Time, 11 a.m. Eastern American Time. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.